Hi YouTube, this is Dwayne here. So today I want to talk a little bit about what the gospel is. And there's a very important reason for that, because the gospel is the central theme of the entirety of the Bible, weaved in from page to page through the Old Testament books, through Moses and through the prophets and the Psalms, and all the way into the New Testament. We got the Gospels, hence the name the Gospels, and we have the epistles and the Revelation. It's weaved all throughout the entirety of the book, because the gospel, Gospel, is the most important thing that we as Christians must know, understand, and practice. That's an interesting thought. So I'm going to say this, and it might be a little heavy and maybe a little hard to hear. But if you don't know what the gospel is, if you misunderstand the gospel, or if you just don't believe the gospel, you are not a Christian. You cannot be a Christian without the gospel. And so because of its important foundational role in the life of a Christian, I wanted to talk about that today. So let's go from there. So now, with that being said, we're going to talk about the gospel. And the gospel means, like the word gospel is taken from the Greek. I'm not sure how it comes over funny. Things happen funny in languages. It's evangelion, which literally means good news. So the gospel is good news. So there's tremendous news to be had in regards to the gospel. Now, we do have to break it up into two parts, okay? Because when there's good news, sometimes there's some bad news that often precedes it. And when this is the case, you know how sometimes people will come up to you and they'll say, "Hey, I got some good news and I got some bad news. What would you like to hear first?" Well, 9 times out of 10, they're going to hear the bad news, probably because everybody wants to end on a high note. So we're going to start there. We're going to start with the bad news, and we're going to work our way over to the good news. So the bad news can be summed up in this phrase. The bad news is that we are sinners, and God has to deal with sin. So that thought should strike fear into you. We are sinners, and God has to deal with sin. So there's two ways that he deals with sin. We're talking about the bad news way, which is to cast it from his presence. And Jesus says that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It is not pleasant. And the other way is part of the good news, which we will talk about in a few moments. So sin, what is it? And how did we get it? I'm going to say this, that sin, by its definition, the Greek word hamartia, means to miss the mark. But of course there's a connotation in that's a little more than a mistake you make, or rather it can also be a deliberate action that you do knowing full well that it was wrong and just doing it anyway. Okay, this is sin. And Paul talks a little bit about this in Romans 3. I'll read from here and you can follow along. It goes, "What then? Are we better than they?" Okay, so Paul is asking, are Jews, because they have received the law of God through Moses and have been sort of custodians to the Torah through the ages, he goes, are we better than they, being those who have not received the law, the Gentiles? And he says, not at all. And he makes it very clear from the outset that just because God had spoken through you as a nation does not make you any better than anyone else. The sin problem still belongs to you, too. It goes, "For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks, or Gentiles, that they are all under sin." So this problem isn't excluded by any ethnic group or anything like that. We are all equally liable to our sin. And Paul goes on to explain that a little further. He goes on to make it a little more distinct. Because as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There are no exceptions here. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. So Paul not only is arguing that sin is attributable equally to everybody, he is also arguing that it is in our own natures. We read that in Ephesians 2. He says that we were by nature children of wrath. Okay, so there's no question about it. We are by nature sinners, and it's really easy. It's actually quite easy to prove this. I use an example from my own home here. So I have a 2.5-year-old son, and one of his favorite things to do is get stuff like broom handles or a long stick and to just start swinging it at people. He just likes to do that. Nobody taught him how to do that. He just likes to do that. So that in and of itself is it's a little bit of an evidence. But here's where the proof, in my mind, this is definitive proof. If I go up to my son and take his play sword away, he will get really upset. My 2.5-year-old son will get really upset, and he'll start crying and he'll start throwing stuff, and then he'll come to me and he'll try to wrestle this broomstick out of my hand. And I'm convinced that if he were big enough, that he would knock me out over the head in order to get that broomstick. And the only reason he doesn't do that is because he is small and he is incapable of doing that due to his limitation in physical strength. So you don't have to teach a child to do that. They just by nature do that. And if you think that sort of mentality goes away when you get older, it doesn't entirely. Now, you get to understanding that there's benefit to not acting that way, but inside there is that mentality of wanting things that don't necessarily belong to you. Now, I mean, that's a specific sin, but you don't have to learn that. It just comes naturally. This is what Paul's arguing here. So let's move on. So now this is where the bad news gets really bad. So entrance into heaven is extremely steep. It is the requirement of perfection. Entrance into heaven requires that you obey and that you listen to and fulfill the entire laws of God, all his commands, that you've kept them all, that you've done them all perfectly. When he said you shouldn't steal, that you've never stolen, not even a penny. Or when he says don't covet your neighbor's things, that you haven't ever coveted anything. Or if he says, or Jesus says not to look at a woman with lust. If you look at a woman in the wrong way, you missed it. That's too bad. 1 point. Missing the law in 1 point is as though you've broken the entire law. That's what the Apostle James says in his book there. So the requirements to get into heaven is very, very, very narrow. And the question is there anyone who can fulfill the law of God perfectly? Of course not. And we've read it here in Romans 3 when Paul says there is none righteous, aka not able to obey the law of God in any, not able to obey the law of God at any point. Nobody, not a single person can. And so this leaves us into a bit of a conundrum. We can try to keep all the commands. We can try to do all of those things. We can attempt on our own perceived righteousness to try to enter into the gates of heaven. But we all know in our heart of hearts that at one point or another we have failed the requirement of the law at some point. And this is truly the bad news, is that there's no way for us to get ourselves into the kingdom of heaven. And we are fully, 100% at the mercy of God. Now I know, okay, today's lesson, today's little teaching, it's a bit of a heavy one, but It's necessary. It's necessary to know that. If something is true, we need to know what that thing is. And so it doesn't stop here. Okay, we're going to stop the video for today, but it doesn't stop here. And we're going to continue with the good news portion of our discussion next week. And we'll be able to finalize that and put you at ease, hopefully, a little bit. Anyway, we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.